On the voyage back, over the next several days, neither Oscar nor Frank renewed their request, and both crews seemed to return to a contented routine. They were lucky with the wind. It blew steadily much more than from the northeast than usual, and let them sail more southeast than they had hoped. Scorpio began leaking less rapidly. Events encouraged Neil. Macklin had probed Philip's wound and removed the second bullet, and the infection seemed to be subsiding. Jean's wound was healing perfectly. No one had shown any symptoms of the plague. The squall had left them with a plentiful supply of fresh water. The only continuing source of anxiety was their food situation. Neil and Frank had rationed 2 boats for a 3-week voyage, rations that assumed that they would be catching at least 1 fish a day. Both boats were trawling all the time and hooking nothing. The seas appeared to be empty. Macklin had machine-gunned a porpoise at dawn one day when he was alone on watch, but the creature had sunk before he could manoeuvre over to it. The blood-stained water had somehow seemed depressing to Neil and Frank, who had rushed on deck at the sound of the gunshots. Because he was sailing more southeast than expected, they were well away from the danger of pirates. Although Vagabond was about 2 knots faster than Scorpio in the trade winds, Neil carried reduced sail and spent a day aboard Scorpio, helping Ollie get every last ounce of speed out of her. At night, Vagabond would sometimes get a few miles ahead of Scorpio and then heave to in the early morning. It was good to see Jim and Lisa looking so happy and well. They were sleeping together now in the forepeak. Jim said jokingly he was determined to share everything with Lisa, even the plague. Macklin now roomed with Frank. Tony had taken up with the slender young woman named Mirabai, apparently stealing her from Greg, the young man with the broken arm. Janice, Oscar's girlfriend, was the only other woman aboard Scorpio, a 3rd crew member apparently having chosen to join the commune at Salt Point just before they left. They met no other ships on their first 6 days out of Antigua. Passed more than 60 miles east of Barbados, and after a week were 70 miles northeast of Devil's Island off the coast of Guinea. The fear of the plague was receding. Jean was not only regaining her strength but her spirit, standing watch with Frank most of the time, playing more happily than usual with Skippy, even enjoying her food more. Ollie too seemed to have regained his high spirits. Frank sometimes spent a day aboard Scorpio as captain, and, back aboard Vagabond, Ollie entertained his friends with exaggerated praise for the oldness of Scorpio, claiming nothing was truly beautiful until it was at least 60. "She's as bold and toothless as me," he said, "but she can still bite." Ollie was aboard Vagabond when they spotted their first vessel. Jim was alone at the helm in an overcast dawn, a little different from each of the last several days. Neil was curled up in a wheelhouse cushion behind him. In the galley, Jean had just begun to parcel out the small bits of dried fish and dried fruit that would be their morning meal. Visibility was only about a mile, and Jim was sleepy at the end of an uneventful watch. Vagabond was ghosting along at only 3 or 4 knots in a light wind, so he glanced mainly at the compass. There was nothing to see out on the water except the same grey slate they'd been staring at for so long. And then, after exchanging a few idle words with Jean and yawning, Jim glanced ahead and saw, so large and clear and close that it was as if God at that very instant set it down in the sea in front of them, a long, grey submarine. Vagabond was sailing forward, barely rocking, and there, ahead and a little to port, lay a submarine, with a red star. A Soviet submarine. For several moments Jim stood staring in disbelief at this grey dawn's apparition, then almost incredulously turned to Neil. "Neil," he hissed in a loud whisper, as if his voice might reveal the 50-foot trimaran's location to the enemy. Neil sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes. A submarine, dead ahead." Groggily, Neil stood up and peered forward. "Living God," he murmured. Jean, aware of suppressed sounds from above, came to the hatchway and looked up. "What'll I do?" Jim asked in a low voice. "Hold your course." Neil knocked on the wheelhouse floor to awaken Ollie, who was asleep below. "All hands," he said in a sharp but low voice. "What's happening?" Jean asked from the hatchway, then climbed the 3 steps and looked out, ahead and off to port. Now only 200 yards away was a submarine, fully surfaced, with a dozen men on the main deck and several in the conning tower. The boat was immense, almost 2 football fields long. It was like sailing past an island. Even as she watched, a gun, some sort of artillery, emerged from the forward deck. Several men clustered around it. She saw several officers in the conning tower looking at them through binoculars. In his underwear, Ollie poked his head into the wheelhouse, hair dishevelled, sleepy-eyed, and the bones of his ribs showing prominently. He blinked at the grey monster. They were going to pass within 100 feet of it. He could see 2 sailors pissing off the bow, and he could also see the 8-foot naval gun being swivelled into position to fire on Vagabond. "Raise your arms," Ollie shouted to them. "Raise your arms. It'll help their morale." Neil lifted his arms in surrender, as did Jean. Jim adjusted his position so that he could steer with his thighs and chest, and then he too raised his arms. "Sheila, get up on here," Ollie shouted, "and bring Skip, Matt." He himself, arms raised, clad only in his underdrawers, walked into the cockpit closer to the enemy. When Sheila came on deck, she took in the scene in stunned silence and slowly raised her arms in surrender. As quietly and softly as a feather drifting in a pond, Vagabond was now gliding past the Russian submarine, less than 90 feet away. On its deck stood almost 20 Soviet sailors, staring in disbelief. In Vagabond's cockpit stood 3 men, 2 women, and a child, all with their arms raised in surrender, facing the barrel of a cannon aimed directly at them. From the conning tower, 3 Soviet officers were conferring agitatedly. As Vagabond sailed gently by, the gun crew turned a wheel and kept the cannon trained amidships. One of them was looking into the conning tower for instructions. The submarine crew had quite possibly discharged up to 12 missiles in the past 2 months, and presumably killed hundreds of thousands, more likely millions of people they had never seen. Now they had a puny cannon aimed at 7 people they could see. An officer on the conning tower shouted something at Vagabond. He sounded angry and shouted again. Vagabond was now sailing serenely away from the submarine and was already 150 feet off. "Shouldn't we heave to?" Macklin asked in a whisper. "Keep sailing," Neil replied quietly, his arm still raised. Again the Russian shouted, this time to his own men, and there was a flurry of activity in the conning tower. A sailor raced down the ladder to the deck. Vagabond sailed on. The cannon swiveled to follow her. A single shot would blow Vagabond to bits. "We'd better heave to," Neil said urgently to Neil. But Neil and Ollie were both grinning. "Keep sailing," Ollie shouted happily. They sailed on, softly, slowly. As if she was tiptoeing past a sleeping giant, Vagabond bore away from the great metal leviathan that threatened to destroy them. For a panicky moment, Neil was convinced the captain of the sub was going to wait until the range presented a challenge to his gun crew and then blast them out of the water. Then that moment passed. The Russian gun crew, and most of it, dispersed. Now they seemed to be occupied with a different problem. The strange, otherworldly meeting of the great grey engine of destruction and the white sailing vessel was ended. Still, Neil and the others stood with their arms raised. "Can't I put my arms down now?" Skippy complained. "Yes," said Neil with strange seriousness. "You can lower your arms. We've beaten them." As they all lowered their arms, Jean stared at the distant smudge of grey on the horizon and then looked at Neil. "Beaten them?" she asked. "No, not beaten them," he said, correcting himself, still looking thoughtfully. "But we won the only way we could have." Ollie slapped Macklin on the back and gave Sheila a hug and kiss. "We showed them, didn't we?" he said, grinning wildly. "They didn't dare fire a shot. Totally bluffed them." Vagabond ghosted on ahead. All that day they celebrated their victory over the Russian submarine, rafting themselves to Scorpio for over an hour to make sure Ollie had a chance to tell everyone the story. They broke out some of the last mollycoddle rum and parted. They were less than 700 miles from the equator and began planning another celebration for that nautical event. They even caught a 15-pound fish, their first in 4 days. It was 9 days since they'd left St. Thomas, and with the fear of the plague disappearing, Jim and Lisa were even accepted as crew members back aboard Scorpio. Jim being a welcome fresh hand at the tedious task of pumping, and Lisa happy to be back with some of the young people again. Neil himself created his own celebration. That evening he again made love to Jean. With Frank seeming to have withdrawn from everybody, he went to her cabin openly while Macklin and Sheila were on watch. The love-making with Jean was more tender than the first time, a long quiet coming together that strangely left them both in tears. Afterwards, Jean talked in a long rush of her hopes for Lisa and Skip, and of their finding a haven. For the first time, Neil found himself sharing her hopes, even as he noticed with a start the bony knees and protruding ribs of Skip lying in the other berth. To bury his fears, to bury their fears, they made love again. At 11 they went back topside. Macklin had gone below to sleep, and Sheila was steering. With Jean went below to check on Philip, Neil went aft to his cabin to radio Ollie. There was something strange in Ollie's voice when they made radio contact. After answering Neil's initial question about how badly Scorpio was leaking, it was taking 15 minutes of manual pumping every hour to clear the bilges, Ollie quietly lowered the boom. Lisa was sick. She had stomach cramps and a fever. She probably had that disease thing we've been worrying about. So, thought Neil, after he'd given Ollie instructions for isolating both Lisa and Jim in the forepeak, this is how it all ended. You could run, but you couldn't hide. You could do everything you could to think of to flee south as fast as possible, and still death, in an unhurried omnipotence, overtook you. Sitting in his cabin in the darkness, he didn't feel like moving. He'd have to tell Jean, Sheila and the others. He'd have to deal with the panic here, and probably worse aboard Scorpio. He'd have to decide what to do. What to do? He wondered how many thousand people, no million people in the last 2 months, had looked up into the ash-grey sky, asked what to do, knowing all the time that there was nothing to do but die. Had they reached that point? Was Jean doomed, even when he felt he'd barely met her? Was Jim, who'd grown from a boy to a man in 2 months, now literally going to burn out at 18? Lisa was sick, cramps and fever. There was an enemy to be fought. They had the advantage of an infinite supply of cool seawater to counteract the fever, and a good supply of aspirin from the Mawson. Lisa, while thin, was still not weak or severely undernourished from their long weeks of short rations. She would begin a personal battle with the youth on her side. As for the disease spreading, Jim was probably infected, but whether others were or wouldn't be depended on luck and discipline. The standing orders he'd given regarding food, sanitation and personal contact had not been taken very seriously until today. Who was to care for the sick? Ollie would do it. He didn't know about the others aboard Scorpio. Over here on Vagabond, Jean would do it, would insist on doing it. Frank maybe. The old Frank would have. Sheila would volunteer. Himself? No. It wasn't his kind of suicide mission. Well, time to go to it. He stood up, took a brush to his hair and beard, as if preparing for a formal call, and left his cabin. By the light of the kerosene lantern hanging down in the main cabin, he could see Sheila at the helm. He could hear Jean's voice below in the main cabin. He came up to Sheila and impulsively put his arm around her. "How are we doing?" he asked. 8 knots southeast, she said, glancing at him quickly, her small grey eyes looking at him slyly like a cat, the lines of aging around them crinkling nicely. "How's Philip?" he asked. "The same. 102. Neil frowned. "Well, 102 won't kill him," he said, "but we won't have him raising sail soon either." "No, it won't." "Ollie thinks Lisa has the plague," Neil announced abruptly. Sheila looked at him again, and then half leaned against him, taking her left hand from the wheel and letting it fall awkwardly against Neil's. "Oh, Neil," she said, slipping her arm around his waist now. "What a bloody shame." "You don't catch death napping." They stood beside each other, staring forward for another moment, then exchanged a warm look and a brief hug. "I've got to tell the others," he said, and went below. Jean was there with Frank, drinking tea and sitting up with Philip, who, now that Vagabond was pounding into windward again, was propped up in a position on his makeshift dinette berth. He was lying under a thin sheet, awake, staring at the ceiling. The panel room had a warm glow from the kerosene lantern that hung from a hook right above his head. Frank was sitting on the edge of Philip's berth, Jean standing up, both looking at him intently when he came in. Neil had the same impulse to embrace each of them. He went up first to Frank, leaning down close to him and put a hand gently on his shoulder. Frank stared back at him in surprise. Neil smiled. "You're a wonderful man, Frank," he said. Neil flushed. "You're stoned," he said. "You've raided Mollycoddle's pot." "You still alive, Phil?" Neil asked, then straightened up, leaving his hand on Frank's shoulder, gently kneading it. Philip smiled and turned his head slightly to look at Neil. "I believe so," he said. "I just wet my pants again." "Good sign," said Neil. "Corpses rarely piss." When he turned next to Jean, he saw that she was also staring at him in surprise. He went up to her, took her in his arms, caressing her lower back, careful of her left shoulder. Looking down at her, he asked, "How are you?" "I'm fine." "What's wrong? Has something happened?" Neil, not smiling, nodded in reply, then released her, glanced at Frank, and paced over the companionway steps before turning and facing them. "Ollie reports that Lisa has cramps and a fever," he said. "He assumes it's the disease we've been worrying about." All three of them looked at him without immediate response. He realised that his statement seemed so inconsistent with his earlier tone of humorous affection that they briefly wondered if this was a sick joke. I chose this risk," he went on, feeling embarrassed by the way he'd acted earlier, though it had seemed so appropriate at the time. "Now we have to pay. I think there's a good chance we can pull her through. We've got to take absolutely insane precautions to keep it from spreading further." "I'll go and take care of her," Jean said. Neil felt his heart sink. "I'm not letting you go," he said gently. "I've already assigned Jim to care for her. I don't think she can give him anything now she hasn't already given him." "Is Jim all right?" Frank said. "Apparently. Ollie said only Lisa is sick. I'm going over to her, said Jean. This is how it ends, thought Neil again. Modern technology finding new ways to kill brave people and brave people rushing to get their share. No, said Neil. Jim will take care of Lisa. I can see my own daughter, can't I? Jean suddenly shouted at him. No, you can't, Neil replied quietly. As you once said, we're one family now. You can't endanger the rest of us unnecessarily. Jean turned away and began to cry. Both Neil and Frank went over to her, made comforting sounds and caressed her, and even as they did, Neil realised they were also trying to reassure themselves and each other as well. Of course, there was no comfort in reassurance for any of them. Neil! Sheila shouted from the helm. Neil hurried up on deck. She was pointing off to starboard, where a red glow was. A red flare, she said. Doesn't that mean an emergency radio transmission? Yes, Neil said, hurrying past her. I'll take it. In his cabin he groped for the flashlight and shone it on the VHF radio he used for short-range ship-to-ship communication. It was already tuned to the correct frequency, and in less than half a minute he established contact with Scorpio. The voice that came back in him was Tony's. Scorpio reads you, vagabond. This is Tony. Lisa's got the plague. Those of us on Scorpio can't stay with her. Either she's got to go, or we do. Over. Neil at first wondered if he heard correctly, but then he knew he had. What the hell do you mean, he shot back nevertheless. Over. I mean, Lisa should be buried at sea now, before she fucking kills us all, or those who are willing to risk their lives for her come stay on Scorpio and we'll shift to Vagabond. Over. So that's what it was all about. Let me speak to my captain over there, Neil said. Over. You're speaking to him. I want Captain Ollie. Neil shifted to receive. He got nothing. He waited. Captain Ollie can't make it, Tony finally said. Over. I'll speak to Jim, Neil fired back. Jim's locked in with Lisa, Tony replied. He can't talk to you either. Look. Neil snapped off the radio and stood up. What selfish cowards. Who were they? Tony and Oscar certainly. The two young women. Would they be so heartless or frightened? Probably. Greg and Annie? They were passive. He went back up on deck. I'm afraid Jean's gone to her cabin to get ready to go over to Scorpio, Sheila reported. Neil looked at her and then nodded. There's been a mutiny on Scorpio, announced. Tony has deposed Ollie and wants to abandon ship or toss Lisa overboard. Good Lord, said Sheila. Poor stupid Tony. Your poor stupid Tony is a... Neil was about to vent his rage with a string of unimaginative obscenities, but stopped himself. We should head for land, Neil, Sheila said suddenly. There we can quarantine the sick and get the best treatment for them. And for Philip. So this is how it ends, thought Neil a third time. The dying rushing to the dying for help. The well murdering the sick. What horror stood next in line? We've no right to take our sickness to land, he said. We fight our battle here, at sea. Some of us will live, some die, but we don't bring death to others. But you're forcing those people on Scorpio to take the biggest risk, Sheila pointed out. No, he answered wearily. I'm ordering Lisa and Jim and Ollie to return to Vagabond.